Okay, we have Mike Haupt here to talk about a little airfield down the street at Milwaukee Avenue and uh, Willow. Um, Now it's called Chicago Executive Airport. It goes back a long, long way. And by way of just a little background and a little teaser, they have customs facilities there full time. And on a regular basis, and I think almost daily, they have flights from there to Europe and there to and from Asia. The flights to Asia usually have to stop in Alaska to refuel. My understanding is the flights to Europe are nonstop. With that, I'm going to introduce Mike. Mike is an expert on airfields here in Illinois. He's written a book right there, which catalogs all the airfields and the histories of airfields here in Illinois. And he knows Palwaukee, what used to be Palwaukee, now Chicago Executive, inside out. And with that, if you could take center stage.
Thank you, Fred. Hi, I'm Michael Haupt. Just to kind of introduce myself, I think of myself as an aviation historian. Unfortunately, I never got my pilot's license. In grade school and middle school, I was all about airplanes and aviation. However, I never had the free time and available money at the same point in my life. I have one or the other, but I know a lot of people who, unless they have them both together, they both get wasted. So I never pursued it. Instead, I got into starting the history of Palwaukee and found there's a whole lot of rich history about aviation in the Chicago area that most people, including most historians, aren't aware of. So this presentation is specifically on Palwaukee's history, and I call it the Airfield of Dreams because since its beginning in 1926, there have been 5 different owners, and each of those owners has had his own unique vision of what the airfield should be based on his personal preferences and the technology of the time. But it's the combination of those visions that have enabled the airport to be what it is today. But before we talk about Chicago, and before we talk about Palwaukee, most people don't realize that Chicago was America's aviation hub prior to World War I. Most people think about, Chicago getting busy and big in aviation around the time Midway started, but it was going decades before that. In fact, even before the Wright brothers flew, Octave Chanute was a Chicago resident. He had a whole long career as an engineer building railroad bridges across the country. He took an interest in later life in aviation. He did his own experiments down in Indiana Dunes. He conducted glider flights, and he made detailed notes of all the airfoils and the shapes and the performance of them. Chanute was very much into sharing information and enabling humans to fly. He was not a real secretive type person. So accordingly, he corresponded with dozens and hundreds of different people experimenting in flight. In the mid-1890s, he started in one of the railroad journals publishing articles from aviators around the world about what their experiences were, what went right, what went wrong, so that information could be shared. As part of the 1893 World's Fair, he organized an aviation expo. There were 50 speakers who had been experimenting in aviation from around the world, made presentations during this week-long thing. Afterwards, he published a book one consisting of those proceedings from the conference, the other a compilation of the articles, and these books were the basis for the Wright brothers' start. When Wilbur Wright wrote to the Smithsonian saying, I want to get into aviation, they referred him to Chanute's works, and they corresponded for years. Chanute even went down and visited them at Kill Devil Hills, where they were doing their experiments. Once flying started in, pardon me, by 1910, the business leaders in Chicago organized the Aero Club of Illinois. This was a civic organization like the City Club or the Mercantile Club, but its goal was to bring and make Chicago an aviation center. The following year, in August of 1911, they produced the biggest air show in the world up until that time. They put up $80,000 in prize money, drew 35 pilots from around the world, putting on a show for a week and a half. They held it in Grant Park. They built 15 hangars to house the planes. They built bleachers to hold 65,000 spectators. The peak daily attendance was 400,000 people. That's the size crowd you get at Lollapalooza today with all the people in the area. It was estimated that over 90% of the people there had never seen manned flight of any kind before. Exhibitions were, we think of them today as trite and cute, but they were really vital in spreading the message of aviation. For decades, for centuries, people had been told that somebody has this idea and they can fly, and they all proved to be lies. So the population was skeptical, and until they actually could see it with their own eyes, they weren't going to believe it. And that's the role the barnstormers filled. They went around the country demonstrating technology, demonstrating the skills. Catherine Simpson here was the fourth woman licensed in the United States, woman pilot. This was in 1912. She barnstormed all across the country. She was based here in Chicago. She even went to Japan and spent a couple of months over there doing her demonstration flights. After World War I, Bessie Coleman, who was a transplant to Chicago, also got interested in aviation. She saved up her money for lessons, but there was not a single instructor in Chicago that would give lessons to a Black woman. So she saved up more money, went to France, and got her pilot's license there. She came back to the United States determined to start a flying school for African Americans, and to fund it, she started doing air shows around the country. Sadly, she died in a crash in 1926. When Chicagoans think about naval aviation, they naturally think about Glenview. And Glenview was a big part of naval aviation in Chicago. But naval aviation got its start here before World War I. Captain Moffett at the time, William Moffett, was the commander of the Great Lakes Training Center. He lived on the North Shore, and his neighbors were those people in the Aero Club of Illinois who were promoting aviation. With World War I looming, they saw that it was vital that the Navy get involved in aviation. So they set up a joint program, the Great Lakes Aeronautical Society. The Aero Club members donated their planes and provided funding, and Moffett set up an aviation program training both pilots and mechanics. Well, this was in 1915, and as you know, Chicago winters can be kind of nasty. And these were flying open cockpit seaplanes made out of wood covered with cloth. Landing that on Lake Michigan in the winter is not a pleasant activity. So by the end of the year, the flight program moved to Pensacola, Florida. But most people don't know the mechanics programs remained here, and it's turned out 2,000 mechanics by the end of World War I. The flight program remained at Great Lakes until in the 30s. It was expanding. It couldn't handle the space, so it moved to what was then what became Glenview Naval Air Station. The beginnings of Palwaukee go back to the early 1920s. And the vision that was involved is that aviation isn't a flash in the pan. Aviation is something important, and it's here to stay. It's not just some temporary thing that's there and gone. One of the barnstormers that there is almost no information about, named Ray Gauthier or Roy Guther, there are a couple of variations in it, but basically he started flying or would do flying activities, small air shows, take people for sightseeing rides near the Des Plaines River Dam number 1. And he would do that quite regularly. And most barnstormers were self-promoters, so it got to be known as Gauthier's Flying Field. Well, this is near, we're not sure whether it was exactly part of a farm owned by two brothers, Frank and Pete Barchart, but they had a sizable farm in Wheeling. And in 1926, they decided that aviation was a real permanent thing, and they devoted 40 acres of their farm to a flying field. They didn't just say, well, if you want to land a plane, go down in this corner. They actually hired a World War I vet to be an instructor and manage the airport. They bought the state-of-the-art, that's a Laird Swallow, for him to use for his flight instruction and other things. It became, the airport itself was the site of the Cook County Fair. And Mayor Cermak was there one day, shaking hands and kissing babies, as mayors are apt to do on political seasons. Less than 2 years later, the Barcharts sold the farm, or sold their airport. In the interim, Lindbergh made this flight across the pond, and immediately everything in aviation was hot financially. It was like the internet bubble or so many other financial bubbles where you put the name aviation on something and it sold. The next owners saw and bought the airport because they saw that aviation was not just a hot commodity, but it was a commercially viable technology that was going to last. 3 sportsmen, which was the name for young, wealthy people in the 20s, got together, led by Owen Barton Jones, and they were pilots, they wanted to fly, and this was the only airport basically on the North Shore. So they bought it, and I'm sure they could make an offer that the 2 farmers couldn't refuse. So again, like the Barcharts, they didn't just have it to keep it, they started investing in it and making it better. The Barcharts had built hangars. Right away, they added heat to the hangars. They provided floodlights for night flights. They bought a newer plane that has an enclosed cabin. So they kept putting money into it and expanding the airport. This is what it looked like in 1930. A couple things about it. This is Milwaukee along the bottom. This is Palatine along the left side. But what you see is an airport without any runways. These were called omnidirectional fields, and they were the most popular. Basically, it's a big grass field because planes of the time were light and didn't have any trouble handling unimproved fields. The circle in the center contained a windsock, and the technique was a pilot would, before landing, fly in low, take a look at the direction of the wind, would also look over the field to see any wet spots, big ditches or anything. And then he would fly around and land directly into the wind, avoiding any problems in the field. So that was a common technique. But you see, there's already, in less than 4 years, a collection of buildings, a couple of hangars and other buildings for administration and all of that. A few weeks ago or a couple months ago, you had a guy talking about forest preserves. And for those of you that are familiar with the area, that's a forest preserve, all plowed in nice rows. And here on the corner is a school. It was called Strong School, but that was one of the local schools in the area. I don't know exactly when, and my guess is it's a Civilian Conservation Corps project that converted this farm into a forest preserve we have now. The new owners promoted aviation. They take out ads in the paper, rides. One of the important things, though, was that their stress was on safety. Pilots didn't have to be licensed back in the 20s. Licensing was optional. But they make a point of talking about all the planes and all U.S. licensed pilots. There was a report by some Cook County board on airport safety, and Palwaukee was at the top of the list in terms of safety. It was one of the best regarded airports, best equipped outside of Municipal Field, which is what Midway was called, which started about the same time. Municipal Field was backed by the City of Chicago funds. This was all backed by the private funds. During the 1933 World's Fair, Palwaukee was closely involved. Beforehand, they built huge hangar to house 2 Goodyear blimps. Goodyear used 2 blimps down on Northerly Island to take sightseers on rides around the fair and the city. The airport itself purchased 2 Sikorsky seaplanes. Each of these carried 10 passengers, and they were also taking off on Northerly Island so that people could go sightseeing either in a fixed wing aircraft or in a blimp. The 2 planes averaged about 500 passengers a day. And it's estimated that 95% of those, that was their first aircraft ride. First ride in any, first way getting any place higher than a tree. By 1938-40, the airport started looking different. Still the same owners, but now they've added a couple of runways, and the buildings are more buildings, more planes in the parking area, and we can actually see a few trees in the forest preserve. We wouldn't really call that a forest quite yet. A few days before Pearl Harbor, U.S. Civil Defense Department started 3 CAP or Civil Air Patrol squadrons in Illinois. One of them was at Palwaukee. The Palwaukee CAP squadron is still operational. It's the longest continuously operating squadron in the state and one of the longest in the country. CAP was a little different back in the war days. Of course, they did search and rescue, which is their main function these days, training and search and rescue. They also did things like towing targets for anti-aircraft fire over Fort Sheridan. They had 3 planes that they maintained at ready all the time, and they would ferry people to nearby cities. People involved in bond drives, businessmen needing to meet with other defense contractors. So if you were doing something war-related, you could go to the CAP and they would give you a flight to Indianapolis or Milwaukee or Detroit or whatever, someplace in the area. If you needed to go further, you'd coordinate with the CAP there and you could travel all around. But that was a major function of theirs, and it was a great help to the war effort. After the war, the owners sold it. No reason has ever been given, but considering they ran the airport successfully for 18 years, it was probably time to move on. The next vision that was prevalent after World War II was that aviation is for everybody. Everybody's going to have their own plane and fly. And this was a vision that was held by Oliver Parks. He has a big name in aviation down in the East St. Louis, Cahokia area. He had a big school, big sales and service facility. He owned a dealership for a small plane called the Air Coupe at Palwaukee. And when Owen Barton Jones decided to sell the airport, he decided that would be great. He'd buy it and he'd have the whole airport as well as his dealership. This is the Air Coupe. It's a little small 2-seat plane that was intended to be very much like driving a car. So pilots sat side by side. Instead of having a stick, it had a yoke, which was like a steering wheel. Instead of rudder pedals to control the planes going side to side, the rudder was linked to the yoke so that when you would turn the yoke, both the ailerons on the wings and the rudder would move simultaneously. The Air Coupe manufacturers claimed that it was impossible to put the plane into a deadly spin because of that. There was great vision. They were going to be everybody's airplane. Marshall Field's sporting goods department on State Street sold Air Coupes. You could go in there, look at a plane and buy it and go out and fly it at Palwaukee if you wanted. And this was not unique. I gave this presentation a few years ago, and afterwards one of the attendees said that he remembers as a kid going into either Carson's or Goldblatt's and getting in an Aeronca, which is a competing small plane. So that was the thing, it was up and coming, and the stores were going to make them available and please their clientele. So this is what the airport looked like near the end of the Parks era, or beginning of the Parks era. It had 5 runways. This is Milwaukee along the top. And we can see there are trees now. It kind of looks like a forest. This is Palatine Road. Parks's main contribution was down here in the southwest corner, built Quonset huts that would hold about 100 small airplanes. Those are Ronkas or air coops or things like that in individual hangars. They were called T hangars because you entered from both sides, so the tails would fit side by side and the wings would be have a wider section. So those last of those came down about 10 years ago. So they were around for a long time. During that period, George Priester got started in aviation. Actually, he got started earlier. He took flying lessons in 1928. For Priester, it was aviation was a family activity. When he got married in 1944, took his wife on a honeymoon in the plane. They flew around and visited various spots. As the family grew and they had children, the children all spent a lot of time around the airport and became very involved in aviation. So, in 1946, he started Priester Aviation. George was, by career, a railroad engineer for Chicago Northwestern. But on the side, he started Priester Aviation, giving flight lessons to various students. George was very oriented to improving pilot skills. So he wasn't somebody just interested in giving you basic flight lessons, but even taking experienced pilots and moving them up to next higher levels. So accordingly, he invested in a link trainer, so he was able to give instrument flying lessons. He bought a twin-engine amphibian, Grumman Widgeon, and with that, he was able to do both instrument flights, give multi-engine lessons, and give pilot seaplane ratings. So anything to get them to the next higher level. In the late 40s, he hired Esther Nofke. She had been a WASP. She got out of the WASP. She had a lot of flight time in twin-engine B-26s. She had also been a link instructor. So she taught instrument training using a link. So she was a perfect fit. Esther became an integral part of Priester's aviation for over 50 years. She became like part of the family as well as a key cog in the business. Well, it quickly became clear that the aviation boom turned out to be a bust and everybody wasn't going to have their own planes. So Oliver Park retreated. He had during its expansion, bought things here in Chicago and a couple other cities. So those all sold off and he retreated back to the East St. Louis area. And Priester bought the airport. His vision was that aviation is maturing. It's now past its adolescence and it's into becoming a mature, complex adult with lots of different aspects, and all of those aspects are important. You have to have them all. So he purchased the airport. Again, this is what it looked like around 1953 when he bought it. This is Milwaukee on the side with the forest preserve. It's got the same number of runways. There's more buildings and there are a lot of planes that are tied down. So activity is picking up, but most of these are all small planes for private flight lessons and personal recreational flights. Priester too was dedicated to safety and made lots of improvements in the airport. He expanded it so it was almost 300 acres. He added hangars, paved runways. He was interested in instrument flight, so he invested in an instrument landing system. So Other planes could come and land there on instruments, as well as his own students could use the airport for instruments. He added a long runway lighting. One of the biggest additions was that of a FAA staffed control tower. Now, basically, the FAA did not like putting control towers on private airports. I mean, that was seen as the government supporting private individuals. We can't use our money for that. Priester made the argument that on weekends in the summer, flights were taking off from Palwaukee about every 45 seconds. It was busier than O'Hare was at the time. And he said, with all of this activity so close, there's got to be some control. And they made a deal in which Priester and the airport provided the building and all the infrastructure. The FAA provided the staff and the electronics and all the radio gear. So again, they were able to get this up before there was any serious incidents. But again, the safety aspect has been at the forefront ever since the early days of the airport. George was a pioneer in a lot of ways. One of the things he did, he was one of the first in the country to provide traffic reports from an airplane. So he would, not every day, but on busy holidays like the 4th of July, fly around and transmit to WGN, which put his transmission out on the radio about major traffic areas and ways around and things like that. He was early looking at the value of small executive jet transportation. Back in the 60s when Learjets were introduced, not only did he buy a Learjet, invest in it for his own charter service, but he became a Learjet dealer for the area. But probably one of the most remarkable ones was back in the 1950s. Some of you may remember John Cameron Swayze in the NBC's Camel News Caravan. Priester took one of his planes and used it to ferry NBC news crews, reporter, and this was film at the time, to various news events breaking around the region. They would come back to Chicago, hurry the film down to get processed so that it could make the 15-minute Campbell News Hour or Campbell News Show. This is what the airport looked like. This is what part of the airport looked like in 1960. Now we can see, hundreds of small planes, lots of hangars all around, and ancillary buildings being built up all over the place. This is Palatine and this is Milwaukee on the side. In 1986, Priester sold to 2 local municipalities, and their vision was that not just is aviation mature, but this airport can be an economic powerhouse for the region. And that's what they have been pursuing. A lot of people are very idyllic about, how great it was to have when the airport was owned by private individuals. There were a lot of challenges to that. One, all that airport land was privately owned and you had to pay property taxes on that. So there's a large tax burden on 300 acres of prime land in Wheeling and Prospect Heights. There were also a lot of legal battles. One of them was ComEd was putting high voltage power lines along Wolf Road at the end of runways. And Priester says, you can't do that. It's FAA regulations against it. And ComEd's attitude was, excuse me, you're our customer. We do not allow our customers to tell us what we can or can't do with our company. So they had lots of hearings before the Illinois Commerce Commission and all of that. Priester ultimately prevailed. There were also various lawsuits back and forth. People suing the airport, not wanting them to do something, or there were individuals who would buy land with the intention of building a large structure at the end of the runway, and they had to be sued in order to stop. So, what happened was Priester prevailed in all of these, but every dollar spent to a lawyer to do that was $1 he couldn't spend improving the airport. So it was just a huge drain, not just financially, but drawing his attention away from what the real business was. Also, as a private airport, he didn't have access to a lot of development funds outside. All the improvements had to be made from what they charged the users. So, that was a pressure that, you had to pay it all yourself and no outside help. At the same time, there were lots of airports around the area, around the country, that were being bought up by developers. Developers were willing to throw bushels of baskets of money towards the Priesters for that big plot of land. Fortunately, George, and by this time Charlie was involved, along with Esther, were determined that Palwaukee would remain an airport. No matter what they were offered, it had to remain an airport. Fortunately, there was a change about the same time in the federal government's attitude. Back in the 50s and 60s, the general attitude in the federal government was that the big airports are all that matter. The O'Hare, LAX, Atlanta Hartsfield, the New York airports. Those are the big ones. That's what drives the country. And we don't care about any of these little ones. Until the little ones started going away. And then they saw that planes that used to land at the little airports are now landing at the big airports. And they realized that if that continued, it's going to overload the large airports, and lots of bad things would happen, both in terms of congestion and in terms of dangerous situations because of the big performance gaps between small planes and large commercial airliners. So once they realized in the 70s that small airports were important, then they came up with a way of promoting what they called reliever airports. And reliever airports are ones that are intended to relieve congestion at the major airports. So that was the goal. But in order to do that, they preferred that the reliever airports be owned by some kind of governmental body. Because as long as it's a privately owned airport, it could be sold at any time. I mean, yes, maybe the owner wants it to be an airport, but who's to say his grandkids will? So the only way to preserve them was to get them in some kind of governmental hands. So in 1986, after years of negotiation, which followed years of investigation of who would be the purchasers, the city of Prospect Heights and the village of Wheeling purchased the airport. Okay, so it then became known as Palwaukee Municipal Airport in 1986. Again, the layout looked very much like it was in Priester's day. There's the long 5,000-foot blacktop runway. We have two parallel runways that are used for training flights primarily. They're shorter, they're less developed, but they can take small planes, and their control tower is down at the south end of the field. Actually, it wasn't at this time. Control tower was built a couple years later. Okay. Again, the municipalities dedicated themselves to safety improvements. They made a lot of improvements to runways and taxiways for safety. As the airport had expanded north, the control tower Priester built at the south end had difficulty viewing activity at the north end. So they relocated the control tower. They built a larger, a taller one in the middle of the field, which had better views of the entire field. They also installed engineered material arresting systems, or EMAS, which is basically crushable concrete at the end of the runways. And what happens is, if you drive on it with anything heavy, the wheels just sink in. Looks like that. And there have been several flights that have gotten into the EMAS. Without the EMAS, the plane's going, it has the, more than likely capability of running through the fence and onto Palatine Road, which is not a pleasant thought. So, that's been there. The other nice thing about it is that there's no injuries to anybody on the plane, and even minor damage to the aircraft itself. So, Palwaukee is known nationwide for its outstanding operations. We have one of the best snow removal reputations in the country. I mean, a lot better than some of the other reliever airports in the area. In 2006, the airport changed its name, became Chicago Executive Airport. There's a lot of mixed feelings about that. The purpose was that the new name was more descriptive to people outside the area of where they were going. If you're not from around Chicago or even the north side, you say Palwaukee, people say, where's that? So for better or worse, it is now officially Chicago Executive Airport, and probably will be for a long time. The airport has 3 world-class FBOs, or fixed base operators. FBOs are kind of everything to service aviation, all in a single spot. They handle all of the ground operations for the planes. So they rent hangar space to them. They tow the planes in and out of the hangars. They move them around. They provide fuel, de-icing. They also have a terminal, which is for charter flights where you go. So instead of going through a large terminal at O'Hare, if you're renting or chartering a flight on a private plane, you go to the FBO and you can go through their terminal, which is smaller and more intimate. They also have basically concierge services for people flying in from out of the region. They can contact the airport, have a rental car waiting, make reservations at hotels or restaurants in the area. If people are coming in for a business flight, they could set up a conference room. They have conference rooms at the FBO itself, or they can get a conference room in one of the nearby hotels whatever it takes to service or assist the flying public. Today, Chicago executive, bigger, more stuff, more hangars, fewer planes, fewer of the small planes parked out in front. In 2021, they did an economic impact study, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but it generates over 400 million in activity every year. 2,000 jobs, both directly and indirectly because of the airport. One of the key things about Chicago Executive is that it has no direct income from any taxes. Neither municipalities provide financial support in any way to the airport. It's nor does it have its own taxing district. Airports like DuPage and Waukegan are both reliever airports, but they have their own taxing district, an airport authority. So there can be they'll have a small levy on your property tax that goes to the airport. Chicago Executive does not have that. It supports itself from user fees and all new construction and everything is a combination of grants from the federal government and the state. So all the activity there is not coming out of local tax dollars. Like all airports, people around airports don't like noise. Chicago Executive has a substantial noise abatement program. Main thing they always do is voluntary cooperation, but there are no laws that are in place that allow an airport to say, you can't fly that plane here because it's too noisy. So what they do then is they get the community involved. They have quarterly meetings where citizens can come and express their concerns. And they have a hotline where you can report specific instances where a plane's noise bothered you, and they can track the location and identify the plane and again, work with the owners voluntarily. But the biggest thing is that the airport, in conjunction with the FAA, has what they call the Quieter Home Program, in which homes that are in high noise pattern areas, the federal government will pay for added noise insulation to the house. And that's going on. It's not an instantaneous process. I mean, it's drawn out. You have to put in your application and it gets approved based on your location. And then they do noise abatement, but they'll add windows, insulation, things like that. So moving forward, the airport's going to be there for a long time. One, it's municipally owned. Second, unlike Meigs Field was able to be destroyed because it never took any grant money from the federal government. It was a park district project and it was wholly supported by the park district. So if the park district and the city wanted it gone, they made it gone. The worst penalty that was able to be inflicted there was something like a $50,000 fine because they failed to give the FAA 6-month notice that it was closing to put in their printed literature. But I mean, that's a nit. All of the money, all of the grant money that Chicago Executive or any of the other airports take comes with a guarantee to the federal government that they're going to be there for 20 years to offset that grant money. You can't take a $2 million grant and decide next year, I'm going to sell it to a developer and, too bad, your grant money's gone. So that comes with, so every time there's construction or a grant, at 20 years rolls out, keeps rolling out. So, and in conclusion, if you can take money and you can build a mile of highway and you go down a mile, but if you build a mile of runway, you can go anywhere in the world. So, thank you. I'd like to take just a moment for shameless promotions. I wrote a book, Chicago Aviation Timeline, which is a comprehensive thing of all aviation activities since the first balloon launch in the 1850s. I also have an assortment of other books available that are all on Chicago aviation. So take a look at that. The more you buy, the more you save. We can talk about that there. The other thing is, coming up on April 17th, it's a Monday, you're having a presentation on Chicago's fountains by Greg Borzo. And he's a friend of mine, a fellow author. It's a fabulous presentation. He's got a book by the same name. It's somewhat misleading because you're not just talking about fluffy fountains. I would think it's a better title of the history of Chicago as seen in public works, public fountains and displays. So anyway, I strongly recommend that you come out for that because he's an excellent presenter and it's a fascinating topic.
Mike, that was terrific. Beyond words, it was terrific.
Thank
And if you all come up and take a look at these books, there's 17 of them up there. And it's extraordinary. It just amazes me. It's extraordinary. 17 books about this area. It's unbelievable. Okay. My question was, or is, you have two municipalities running this airport. Do they contract this out to a service that runs airports? Or
the FBOs or fixed base operators are like chains of gas stations.
I'm sorry?
I said those fixed base operators, those FBOs, are like chains of gas stations. So there is signature at O'Hare as well as here. You can go across the country and find other places that have a signature FBO. And like all marketing today, if your company is in a frequent user program with them, you get discounts and
so
things like
these
that.
Cities lease the property to them? I don't understand.
The airport leases the property to the operator.
Great. Thank you so much.
And the airport also leases all the hangar space for years.
Hold on.
I'm interested in how large the planes are that go clear overseas. We've flown from here to Naples, but I mean, you need to refuel. And we were in a 6-seater plane. How big are these planes that go overseas, you said?
The largest that can fly out of executive have a 9,800 pound maximum weight limit. So these are like Gulfstreams, Falcons, planes like that hold up to no more than 19 people. So
You didn't talk about the Curtis Wright Field, which became the Grandview Naval Air Station.
I have another piece of shameless promotion. I have a list there of different presentations that I give. And I have one that covers the early Chicago history, not just Palwaukee. And then another one on the Chicago's role in the development of airmail services, airmail and how they converted into airlines. So yeah, there are about 60 or 70 airports around Chicago area that aren't here anymore. And Curtis Wright Glenview was just one. Curtis Reynolds first. Yeah.
Back when George Priester owned the airport and there was a lot of litigation going on, didn't he threaten to turn into a pig farm?
Yeah, I mean, there are statements like that that you make just out of frustration. I mean, I do not believe, and I'm not sure whether his son, who was the former head of Priester Aviation, actually joined the webcast, but Zoom, yes? He said yes? Okay. Oh, he is on Zoom. Okay. Well, anyway, he would be more knowledgeable about that. But just because that comment was made, I do not believe that he was seriously entertaining thoughts of branching out into farming.
Still on Mr. Priester, I found it fascinating to hear that he could build his own tower and convince the FAA to staff it and run it for safety's concerns before there was any major disaster. It seems like today, many times you need the disaster to get any action. And there are examples of that in aviation today.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
I'm just wondering how we advanced to becoming so stupid.
I wish I had the answer to that. Yeah, we definitely seem to have gone backwards in a lot of different ways.
There was a wonderful restaurant. It was something about 54. We used to go there, have dinner, and listen to the control tower. Signal. What happened to the restaurant?
Chicago Executive or Palwaukee was the 94th Aero Squadron.
That's it.
It was a World War I themed restaurant, and it had nice picture windows along the runway. You could hear tower activity. It shut down. I'm not sure why initially, but back in probably the mid 80s for the first time. And then it reopened 2 or 3 more times. And it seems, in my opinion, each iteration got progressively worse until it was, intolerable.
Okay, I have one other question.
Yeah.
Has there been any seller's remorse regarding Meigs Field? I mean, the businessmen coming in.
Oh, I mean, there's the users are still upset about it. I mean, that's the thing is, I don't think there's any remorse from the city. And unfortunately, the hard facts are that it's next to impossible to build a new airport today. The length of time it takes to, even if you have cooperation, acquire the land, do all of the required studies, engineering studies, environmental studies, everything, and then let out bids and do the construction. You're talking 25 years and hundreds of millions of dollars at best for a small field. So there's just no way there are going to be any more. Airports are an endangered species, unfortunately. Small airports especially. So.
We're going to go now to answer questions on Zoom. Zoom.
Yes, thank you. A totally excellent presentation, both the content and the way you did it. So we appreciate that. There is a mention of, boy, I guess there would be some really interesting stories from the Priester family. And I'm suggesting that maybe we need to have Bob look at that and get with Charlie and see if we can do another program that talks about some of them. Let me go through some of the screens that I saw. I'm making the assumption, Judy is asking, can a Boeing 737 land? Do you know what size plane might be able to land?
No, the largest ones, 737s, are too large. Largest ones are like Gulfstreams, Falcons, some of the large Bombardiers.
Okay. Another question I had, is there any, do you know what historically that land had before it was settled, or was it just simply open land, farmland, or Native Americans? Do you know
Well,
anything about that?
I mean, before it was an airport, it was farmland, and before it was farmland, it was open Native American land. So that, Charlie, did you want to respond to the?
Well,
any
a couple of thoughts. Great presentation, Michael, and lots of interesting stories. We could probably talk all day on some of the things that happen. Maybe to attempt to respond to a couple questions. The runways, every airport has weight restrictions on runways. So one of the concerns of residents and people are that we'll have airline type equipment, 737, 757s, and so forth in there. With the rate restriction, that doesn't happen. That's restricted. The capability of the new jets, the new corporate jets, and they're small, relatively small, can travel 7,000 miles nonstop without fuel. Without stopping for fuel. So there's a lot of capability if the airport and the runway lengths will allow that. But maybe to answer the question, I think the weight restriction certainly would preclude air carrier type of equipment from landing not only at I'm going to keep calling it Palwaukee, but at any airport.
I don't know if Charlie, if you want to take this on, or Michael. How safe was flying during the days when licenses weren't required as compared to automobile safety? I mean, we know now it's probably harder, safer to fly than it might be to drive. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me take that. That one report that I referenced by Cook County on airport safety, I think this was around 26, 27, but they cited 17 aviation fatalities in Cook County itself. Now you think about the number of planes that were flying, that's a really large percentage. Out of those, 16 of the fatalities were unlicensed pilots. The 17th was a licensed pilot who had the misfortune of having a midair collision with an unlicensed pilot.
Got it.
Licensing, mandatory training, regulation does work.
David Waterman is asking this question. What's the state of the art for security fencing, which has evolved over the years?
I'm not an expert of that. There are different requirements and they vary for the different size airports. So our security fencing at executive or a reliever airport is more than for some of the smaller airports, and the fencing required at municipal and O'Hare is much greater than it is at the reliever airports.
Okay. I have a couple more. Mary is asking, how many flights take off every day on average? Mostly from companies or private individuals?
Both. I mean, private individuals tend to fly more on weekends and days off if they're recreational flight. Most of the flights during business days are somehow work related. They can be for.
Any idea of how many of flights a day?
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head.
Okay, last question. Is there any famous people, individuals that have made use of this airport that we might know?
Yeah, but
I can answer.
a lot of the people that you would recognize that come through the airport don't like to have it said that they come through the airport. There
That's
are
a good answer.
people at each of the FBOs who can talk about celebrities that they've seen and they talk to, but that is not information that any of those individuals want made public.
Charlie?
Yeah, I can answer that just briefly. I don't think these people would mind. During the years that I was there and they were there, names that you would recognize is Obama was there in and out. We flew George Bush and his dad was around. We flew Teddy Kennedy. So there's a lot of people. I personally had an opportunity to spend about a half hour with Colin Powell. It was a really terrific half-hour discussion. So, you know, people come and go, and all good people. Everybody there is important, but there are names that we would all recognize.
And
Excellent. Thank you, Charlie.
one of the Priester charter partners was Arnold Palmer for a while. So
That's a long drive.
Yes, it is.
Excellent program. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Charlie. I'm going to turn it back to the auditorium.
thank you.